I think old houses are just supposed to be scary. The creaks, the groans, the shadows that you see or think you see. It's all just part of living in an old farmhouse. At least that's what my parents would tell me, back when I'd cry out for them in the middle of the night to protect me from whatever imagined threat my slumber had conjured. The long unlit hallways with doors that seemingly led nowhere, the lights that would flicker at even the slightest hint of rain, the cellar that had long rusted shut, and the untold horrors that might lurk within. It all provided the perfect fodder for my young and developing mind. It can be both a blessing and a curse to be a child and have such an overactive imagination. The dreams and fantasies are the stuff of legends. The nightmares and terrors, not so much. Little things like making sure your feet and head are covered and night lights only work so far. You either overcome your fear or eventually it overcomes you. Fortunately for me, the soft lullabies from my mother and the stern yet comforting reassurances from my father eventually won out. My nightly terrors and fever dreams became a relic of my distant past. Prospects of college and a life outside the family nest lured me away as soon as I graduated high school, and eventually contact with my family began to taper off. There were no harsh words exchanged, no bad blood. Life simply took me in a new direction. My family was supportive, and they had their dogs and goats to keep them alive and working. I still wrote and called as often as I could, and holidays on the homestead were an annual tradition. Yet still, no matter how old I got, no matter how many times I would sleep in my old bed as a grown man, I never forgot those early years, the night terrors, and the dread of something crawling up through my sheets, right on top of me. The last few years have been harder than the ones before. My work has taken me all over the world on endless trips, and some of my pilgrimages to the house become less and less frequent. Phone calls have also dried up on both ends, and I guess I've just settled into my new normal as work swallowed me whole. Then the call came. The call every child dreads past a certain age. I was just heading out the door to catch my car to the airport when the call came. It's said when an offspring loses their parents, they can truly feel their own mortality for the first time. My autopilot turned on swiftly as my father's lawyer, Harold, laid out the entire story during my long car ride. But right from the beginning, nothing was sounding right. They'd been dead for the past several weeks, Harold told me, his words thick with a cold and corporate verbiage used by most practitioners of his profession. Weeks? Why was I just hearing about this now? My heart sank, and immediately I was plagued by an inescapable current of guilt. My thoughts raced to recover the last memory I had of my parents, the last phone call I'd made, but I couldn't place the specific memory. Had it really been that long? Harold couldn't tell me much more other than a vague time of death, as there was still an ongoing investigation by local, state, and federal agencies. That was the most unusual of all. What could have possibly happened that so many law enforcement agencies were involved in the deaths of an elderly couple? Harold was incredibly restrained in what he would divulge, and I was more than a little frustrated with him after just a few minutes. Worse yet is that all their dogs and goats had been reported missing and they were assumed to have run away, but no one had seemed to have located them yet. My parents' will had been very clear, however. All their assets, money, and, yes, the old homestead, were to be left to me, with a small portion going to the various charities that they had supported over the years. I barely had time to process the situation before my driver announced that we had arrived at the airport. In a hazy blur, I was guided through customs, and before I knew it, I was across the pond yet again. Attempts to drown my guilt and sorrow with my work only ended in sleepless nights, with only a morning hangover to remind me that I was even still alive. Mercifully, this trip was a short one, and once I was back home, I packed a bag and began my journey back to the homestead. That was when I made my first and biggest mistake. I hadn't wanted to bring Ollie along with me on this trip. Something right from the very beginning was gnawing at the back of my mind and telling me to stay behind. Ollie was my beloved Australian Shepherd, given to me as a gift by my friends for a birthday long ago. He'd only just reached the 10-year mark, but was still as lively and as energetic as ever. He'd also never been to the house before, as it was an unnecessary expense to bring him along. I missed him during my long stretches away from home, and was eternally grateful for my neighbors who cared for him in the interim. But now, I was torn between my grief and the fear at being alone in the house for the first time in my adult life. So after debating it over for a few days, I decided that Ollie had to come along. I wish I had just left him home. I'm sorry, Ollie. The homestead was far enough away that a long-distance drive with Ollie in the car was out of the question. So we flew quite comfortably first class. Well, I did at least. Though I made sure that Ollie was snug and well taken care of in the pet cargo. We landed in the middle of a tumultuous thunderstorm, and Ollie was not pleased at having to run in the torrential downpour to the pickup area. My old childhood friend, Christine, was waiting patiently nearby. Christine and I had been the best of friends growing up. Her parents had lived only 2 houses down from ours. We naturally grew apart, as most childhood friends do, but kept in contact via Christmas cards and the now occasional Facebook chat. She had been devastated to hear about my parents, as she had helped care for them as they had gotten older. The entire town had been talking about it, though it was a hush-hush subject according to her. People would look over their shoulders to make sure they weren't being overheard before asking any questions regarding the strange deaths. Our ride to the house was uneventful. A storm raged on around us as we turned down familiar streets, passing a joint back and forth and making the occasional joke, just like old times. Under different circumstances, I had hoped to make Christine my wife someday. Our paths had crossed, but had never intertwined long enough for a connection to truly take root. My work had made me a virtual recluse, and with my familial connections now gone, suddenly my world seemed much smaller and lonelier. Christine made the final turn onto the meandering driveway that led to the house. Normally the lights from inside could be seen shining all the way from the road, even in the harshest storms. Tonight, with no one to keep the lights on, the scene was shrouded in by the inky black night sky. Once upon a time, the shutters had been painted a bright pink, the wraparound porch adorned with benches and flowers, and each window had been illuminated by just a single candle. There was none of that now, and there never would be again. The shutters had long since faded and the paint chipped away, the benches and porch now overgrown with brush and shrubbery. The car idled silently, and all 3 of us sat there, taking in the scene before us. Nature had definitely taken its toll in the house, and with the storm flashing its rage right behind it, the homestead had never looked more uninviting. "You going to be okay here by yourself?" Christine spoke up. "You can always stay with me." I looked over at her smiling face, a tempting offer to say the least. My thoughts raced to our last night together before I had left town for good. The way her face looked in the dim light of her bedroom. The way her lips had tasted of whiskey. "Thanks, but I think I'll be alright. It's just for a few days until the estate is settled," I said begrudgingly as I reached into the back to get my bags. I went to leave the car, but looked back at her to say goodnight. Christine was no longer looking at me, but out of her windshield back at the house. Something about her expression concerned me. She looked cautious, almost scared. There was an intensity in her eyes I had not seen before. She wasn't looking at the house, she was looking beyond it. Perhaps something nearby, or perhaps something inside. Something wrong? I spoke up. Her response was delayed. She didn't snap out of it or anything like that. Just a moment's pause, and then looked back at me as she spoke. No, nothing, just be careful. Ever since your folks passed, this house has been giving us all the willies. You wouldn't believe some of the things people have been saying around town. My curiosity was piqued now. This had been the first real bit of information I had got from anyone about the deaths since the news had broken to me. Like what? I asked, though I'll admit I was more than a little anxious to know the truth. Oh, it's just rumors. You know how people are here. They gossip when they don't know, or they want to find out on their own. There's some talk about the county sheriff's office coming out here. Someone thought they saw the FBI. I even heard old Mrs. Jenkins claim that they saw animal control up here not too long after the bodies were found. Animal control? I said incredulously. I looked back at the house, now envisioning some monstrosity ripping its way out of the walls and into the world beyond. Oh, I wouldn't think too much into it. I think they just want to know what happened. And quite frankly, so do I. Christine admitted. Me too. Was all I could muster. A quiet, dark energy had quickly taken over the mood. Well, wish me luck, I said as I stepped outside, rain instantly soaking through my first layer of clothing. Ollie hopped out right behind me and was already sitting on the front porch before I had even gotten the rest of my bags out of the trunk. Call me if you change your mind. My home's always open, Christine said with a smile and a glint in her eyes. I certainly would. I laughed and waved her goodbye. She idled by just long enough to see me reach the porch and grab my keys. I watched her truck lights recede into the distance until there was nothing to see but the house and the stormy night around me. The rain had already soaked me almost completely, and so the drafty, empty house hit me like an Arctic blast as I stepped through the door. Dropped my bags and flipped on the lights, and for the first time in what felt like years, took a look at my childhood home. The damage was worse than I thought. The ceiling was stained with what I can only guess was water damage, and the grand staircase was missing several banisters. Every painted wall was cracked and peeling profusely. Wiring was also getting old as the lights were flickering in and out in sync with each beat of the storm. Though the most striking thing to me was the sheer number of cobwebs coating almost every corner and surface. Yeah, they've been dead for weeks, I guess, but just how long had they been in this house, unattended, while the rest of the world went on around them? I knew my parents' condition had deteriorated in recent years, but I had no idea it was this bad. Plus, Christine was supposed to be here to be helping them out around the house. How had things gotten so bad here? I walked forward and finally became aware of the echoing chattering of my teeth from the cold. I swung around to close the door behind me, only to see Ollie still sitting on the front porch, looking directly at me. It was unlike him not to enter our house after I had entered. I called Ollie over to me, but he refused. Very strange. I called out for him again, this time a bit more urgently, but he still remained cemented to his spot on the porch. Rain was starting to wash inside the door frame, and I was getting chillier by the second. So once again, I called for Ollie, this time in a much more commanding voice I had only used when he was being a bad boy. Ollie reluctantly crossed the threshold, holding his head down and refusing to look at me. Closing the door, I shrugged off Ollie's odd behavior and looked back at the mess around me. Paint and cobwebs, water damage. This was all going to cost time and money to fix, and time and money that I really didn't have right now. What little I was going to be able to do on my own was going to have to wait until tomorrow, so I lifted my bags and walked up to the stairs to my old bedroom. I hadn't stayed in my actual bed in years, preferring the comfort of the guest room and king-sized mattress inside. But something inside of me was feeling nostalgic, so I passed the guest room and rounded the long hallway to my old childhood dojo. I was surprised to find Ollie riding my tail, as he would normally prefer to explore his surroundings on his own. But now he was practically attached to my hip. My parents hadn't so much as touched my room in the years I had been gone by the looks of it. A fine layer of dust covered every surface, even the bed, which was still fully made in the same sheets and blankets I had graduated high school in. Ripped the covers and pillowcases off, causing clouds of dust to fill the air. I grabbed a few new blankets from the closet and fitted them onto the bed. Not 2 seconds passed before I flung myself onto the bed. Instantly, my eyes began to droop, and I could feel the sweet, beautiful release of sleep beginning to wrap its fingers around my subconscious, though a sharp growling jolted me awake just seconds before I had drifted away. I spun my body around to face the door, where Holly was sitting, once again just outside the threshold. He was in his defensive pose, head leaning down and growling at something down the hall. "Ollie?" I asked quietly. There was no way that there was anyone in the house, yet I couldn't help but feel Ollie's aggression was warranted. Without warning, Ollie took off down the hall, making no noise as he went. I dashed over to the door to catch him, but he was around the corner and, from the sound of it, had already made his way downstairs. Dragged myself after him, having half a mind to just go to bed without him. The house, while no mansion, was big enough that Ollie's growling echoed off the walls, so I had difficulty locating him. Followed the sounds of his growls until I finally found him around the corner from the kitchen. Irritated, I called for him to come, but as was becoming the new normal, he appeared not to even hear me, his gaze remaining fixated on the wall. I had had enough of his antics by this point, so I regrettably jerked him by the collar. "Let's go, Ollie, it's time for bed," I yelled. His loud, sudden barking took me completely by surprise, so much that I let go of him and his gaze fell back onto the wall. For the first time, I looked at what he had been so fixated on. It wasn't the wall, it was the basement door. In all my years, I had never actually even been in the basement. My parents had the only key, but told me that they kept it locked due to water leaks and mold that was down there. I never questioned this story before, as I had no real desire to spend any amount of time in that basement anyways. I just remembered the rusted cellar doors and the vivid night terrors from my past. Ollie must have sensed its dark aura. Why else would he be so triggered by this place? I'd never taken Ollie here for a good reason. I was beginning to deeply regret it at that moment. I tried one more time to call Ollie, but as far as he was concerned, I might as well have been on another planet. "Fine, sleep out here," I said dejectedly. I marched back upstairs, leaving Ollie to continue his stare down with the basement door. On the way back upstairs, I could feel wisps of cobweb brushing past my face. This place was going to need a serious cleaning. I couldn't have been out for more than a couple of minutes before I was jolted back awake by the loud, distressed whimpering. I bolted upward to see Ollie at the foot of my bed. Initially happy to see him, I reached over to give him a pat on the head when I saw a small amount of blood coming from his neck. Panicking, I picked him up in my arms and took him to the bathroom, where I hoped there would still be some emergency first aid supplies. I was in luck and treated the wound as best I could. It was hard to tell with Ollie's fur in the way, but I could make out 3 distinct entry marks, all deep purple from the swelling. Ollie didn't appear injured beyond that, though, and once the bleeding stopped, I taped some bandages on and did my best to comfort him for the rest of the night. I definitely had trouble going back to sleep after that. Ollie would lay at the foot of my bed, then perk up and start growling at the walls before attempting to go back to sleep himself again. The storm petered out at just past 1 in the morning, and soon my ears were alive with the creaks and moans of the old house. Just like old times, I thought to myself. Several times, just before I was about to fall back asleep, I registered something just below the normal threshold. I wasn't sure if I had heard it the first time, and then I heard it again. The unmistakable pitter-patter of tiny legs walking up the wall. No. I forced these mental images from my mind in the vain attempt at fading into a nightly slumber. But at around 6 in the morning, just as the tiniest shades of blue were beginning to appear in the sky, I decided that I had tried enough. It was about only a couple hours, but it was obviously the only sleep I was going to get. Ollie, however, was sound asleep. The lucky bastard. I thought it best not to wake him, so I tiptoed around him and made my way to the bathroom. It was strange, going about my morning routine at the homestead. I hadn't used the shower or brushed my teeth or even made coffee in this place in so long. I still racked myself with guilt over not remembering the last time I had been here. What were the last things I had even said to them? Did they miss me before they died? Did they know in their final hours, even though I hadn't been as close to them as I once was, that I had loved them dearly with all my heart? I must have hit a nerve as the floodgates opened and I found myself on the floor of my shower, crying hysterically. I didn't know how long I was like that. I only snapped out of it once the hot water began running out. I got out, fixed myself up, and went to the kitchen, where I was greeted by Ollie, who was once again staring at the basement door. Ollie's behavior hadn't made much sense to me last night, but I was too tired to care. But now it deeply unnerved me. What was he sensing behind that door? The key must be around here somewhere. Now was my chance to face my fears as an adult. I searched feverishly around the house, opening drawers and raiding closets, but finding nothing but dust and more cobwebs. I had just showered this morning, yet I was already starting to look like a coal miner. The whole time, Ollie never stopped looking at the door or growling just under his breath, even when I'd laid his food out for him. I was just about to search the upstairs when the doorbell rang, out of tune and almost too low for me to hear it. I hadn't been expecting anyone, so it was quite a shock to say the least. Though when I opened the door, I was immediately relieved. Harold had told me he was coming over in the morning, but I had completely forgotten. And he was adorned with his top hat and leather briefcase that I think every lawyer is required to have. "Good morning. Come on in, Harold." I greeted him as he let himself in. We had chatted some more over the phone since he contacted me, but this was the first time I had actually seen him in person. My parents had mentioned him on occasion when talking about their wills and plans for their post-mortem, so they had obviously trusted him. Yet something inside of me resented having him here. He was a bit younger than I had expected, probably around my age. His plain gray suit and pants were so average I had almost wanted to take him shopping. Only his pink bow tie really set him apart from any other lawyer. "Can I get you anything?" "No, that's okay. I won't be here long," he said curtly, just as stoic and detached as he had sounded on the phone. He looked around him intensely, as if he were inspecting the house. Without another word, we went into the kitchen and got to business. The funeral services had already been paid for, and arrangements had already been made. The director still needed me to sign off and approve of everything first, which I told Harold I would do later that day. All monetary assets would be transferred to me after taxes and final expenses had been paid, and the house was for me to do with whatever I wanted. I asked him if my parents had left behind any specific items, hoping that maybe he had the key. He disappointingly told me they had not. The entire time we were talking, he had kept his eyes around him, barely even looking at me. After tossing it around for a second, I finally got the nerve to speak up. "What the fuck happened here?" I asked bluntly. "I beg your pardon?" he asked unconvincingly. He knew exactly what I meant. "This whole time you've been here, you've not taken your eyes off the door. The dog is freaked out, everyone in the town is freaked out and saying crazy shit. just want to know what happened here. What the fuck happened to my parents in this house? Harold looked at me, studying my expression and plotting his next move carefully. He had an ulterior motive for being here, and I knew it. I just didn't know what it was for. I don't know what you and the people in this town gossip about, but that's none of my business. And I'm sorry I don't have the information you want. All I know is what the police have told me, he told me sternly. His expression was dead serious, and though I suspected he knew a little more than he was letting on, had no reason to not believe him, so I let it go. After signing some more papers, he wished me a good day and left without another word, not even bothering to let me escort him out. I sat at the kitchen table, puzzled now more than ever. Ollie had finally left his spot by the basement to eat, but had only nibbled his food before going back to the door. I looked all around me. I wanted nothing more to just unload this place and never return. Even if nothing had happened here, this place was cursed now, and it could never be home for me again. And part of me thought about how satisfying it would be to watch the entire thing go up in flames. I wasn't rich, but I definitely had enough money that I didn't need to sell it. I could just keep it and let the elements do their thing. Just let it become yet another relic of the past. I looked back at the dusty clock on the wall. It was just past noon. I figured I might as well make my way to the funeral home and get that nightmare over with. Went upstairs to wash my face and change into something more presentable, brushing past several more cobwebs on the stairs. Once ready, I went back downstairs to wish Ollie goodbye. He actually looked at me when I called him from the basement door. His eyes looked worried, and his wound, while no longer bleeding, looked even more swollen than it did before. I made a mental note to pick him up some medicine from the vet as I leaned over and gave him a big kiss, one which he returned in kind. I bade him one final farewell and then left. That was the last time I ever saw Ollie. My drive to the funeral home was the most peace I had felt since arriving in town. The driver didn't bother me once I placed my headphones on, so I was able to sink into the world of my favorite podcast, even if only for a few minutes. Putting some distance between me and that house was exactly what I needed, as I was feeling positively cheery once I arrived at the funeral home, which must have confused the funeral director greatly. Thankfully, there wasn't much to go over, as my parents had elected to be buried side by side in matching caskets. I think seeing their photos amongst all the flowers made everything real, and I was at the risk of breaking down again. The director, as kind of a man he was, didn't pressure me into buying anything extra, and did his best to offer his condolences. As we were wrapping up, I asked him a question, which I already knew what his answer would be. What happened to them? Excuse me? The director asked. My parents, how did they die? No one will tell me, not the coroner's office, not the police, no one in town knows. You're the funeral director, you've seen them, please tell me. The man looked sympathetic to my plight, but his expression said it all before his lips could even move. I'm sorry, I'm not at liberty to discuss that, I'm afraid, he told me. A reply that was so forced and so scripted, I knew it had to be so. Why not? Why can't anybody tell me what happened to them? What are you hiding from me? I was beginning to lose my cool, and the director did his best to calm me down. No one in town knows what happened, only what they found afterwards. The bodies were found together in bed. Apparently they had been dead for almost a month, maybe longer. No apparent cause of death either. I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you more, but that's all the information that I have, he told me. Well, you've seen the bodies, what do you think happened? I asked. He didn't respond, he just looked away to avoid my gaze. Something right underneath his eyes was telling me it was bad. I don't know. I'm sorry. The director was quiet and almost more remorseful as he spoke. Then let me see them myself, I pleaded with him. I knew he wanted to say no. It's what he'd been told to say by whatever shadowy figures that were keeping this entire thing under wraps. But enough was enough. It was time that I finally got my answers. I don't think that's a good idea. The amount of degradation, and I don't care. Please, I need to know for myself. He turned around to face me again. He mourned for me and my family and wanted to do what was right, even if it was placing himself in potential danger. Very well, was all he said. I followed him to a back room, which turned out to be the area where my parents' caskets were being held until the service tomorrow. The room was dimly lit, as was the rest of the building, and the chilly air was beginning to slowly creep its way up my arms and legs. "I'll be outside if you need anything," he said, and left without a word, closing the door behind him. My parents had never been the flashy types outside of the home they kept. Their caskets were simple white, adorned with gold trimming. Elegant, graceful, it was everything that they deserved. I ran my hand down one of them, unsure of who was even underneath. Just one look. It didn't even have to be both of them. Whoever was laying underneath of me right now, and that's it. I braced myself, grasped the bar, and lifted it up. There are some things in this world that God himself can never prepare you for. Some things which you may never recover from. I could only look for a second. That's all it took. 1 second for the image of my mother's emaciated and near skeletal corpse to be burned into my mind forever. I jumped back, almost knocking my father's casket to the ground. The lid slammed shut, thankfully, and I did my best to keep from screaming as I bolted out of the room. I bumped into the director, but I was already out the door and down the road by the time I became aware of him shouting my name and trying to flag me down as I left. I just kept running. When I reached a bus stop, I ordered another driver, and while I waited, I dry heaved and did my best to keep from freaking out over the possibilities. What could have done that? She looked as if she'd been drained of almost every bodily fluid imaginable. Gone was her radiant beauty and warming smile, stripped of everything that made her my mother, not just a dry husk of a corpse. I was on autopilot again as my driver picked me up, not speaking a word the entire ride. I asked her to drop me off several hundred yards away from the house, and as she drove away, I just stared dead ahead. I don't know for how long, maybe an hour, maybe a minute. Time had a funny way of losing meaning around this house. I thought back to when I was a child. I studied every crevice of the house, thinking of every room, every nook, every cabinet, every closet, any possible space that could have been a hiding spot. But even as ideas and possibilities came to me, I knew that there was only one place that I needed to look. The basement. No way, I thought to myself. No way was I going down there now. Why did I have to know? I'd never played detective before. I'd never had a thirst for danger. I'd never had a death wish before, so why was I in such a hurry to die now? This is nuts. I just needed to get Ollie and book it the hell out of here. Stay with Christine like I should have done last night. Walk the remaining distance to the house and up to the front door before stopping. The door was slightly ajar, not how it had been when I had left. Cautiously, I walked forward and nudged it open with my foot. Peering inside, I almost gasped out loud. The ceiling was now fully covered in an intricate wall of webbing. It was hanging and clinging to almost every surface, with a literal maze now taking up a bulk of the staircase. Icy chills charged up and down my veins. This wasn't natural. Whatever was spinning this web was doing so far faster and in far bigger quantities than I thought possible. A gut reaction was telling me that Ollie was already done for, but I couldn't leave without him. Not without knowing for sure. I stepped inside as quietly as possible, propping the door wide open in case I needed to make a quick escape. I whispered for Ollie, hoping if he was still here he'd be able to hear me. I waited, but my beloved animal did not come racing forward to greet me as he normally would. I called out a little bit louder, still keeping my voice down, but still no sign of Ollie. I listened carefully for any noise. It was eerily calm and quiet, the kind of silence you hear in the woods when your heart of hearts tells you a predator is nearby. Every natural instinct I had was telling me to leave, to never come back, and leave Ollie to whatever fate had awaited him. I pressed onward, brushing more cobweb out of my face. When I turned the corner, I could see the kitchen and basement door looming ahead. Still no sign of Ollie. I was about to turn and go upstairs when I heard it again. The sound from last night. Tiny little legs crawling up the walls. I leaned forward a bit to see where they were coming from. Louder. A bit closer. Louder. Closer. Even louder. I pressed my entire face up against the door. It sounded like little tiny drums, all going in unison. I listened for something, anything else. Nothing. Then from the other side of the door, from somewhere deep in the basement, the unmistakable yelp of an injured dog. My fight responses kicked in immediately. I began pounding at the door, tearing at the hinges, doing whatever I could to break the barrier. I cried out for my Ollie, screaming threats at whatever abominations dare lay their claws on him. But the door stood firm and immobile. There was no way I was getting down there. I slumped to the floor. What was I going to do now? I couldn't leave, not when I knew I could still save him. But there was no other way into the basement. Then I remembered. I got up, armed myself with the only weapon I could find, a fireplace poker, then walked straight outside. The sun was already beginning to slip behind the clouds, casting a violent orange glow on the house. I followed the stones my mother had laid almost 5 decades previously, guiding the path to the cellar we never used. I stopped right in front of the rusted doors that had never been opened as far as I could remember. Until today. Without thinking, I tried prying the lock off with the poker, but 40 years of rust wasn't going to give without a fight. I was persistent though, and started hearing creaks in the metal. I wedged the poker underneath the bent lock and slammed all my weight onto it. The lock snapped off almost instantly, and I ducked in time to avoid it ricocheting off the cellar and into the air. Looked back and opened the latch, pulling the doors wide open. The basement floor lay exposed beneath me. There was a ladder at the bottom, and I stepped inside to jump down on it, though the ancient stool splintered into pieces the second my feet had touched it. I fell against the wall, hitting my head pretty hard, and as I recovered, I took note of my surroundings for the first time. So this was the cellar, the place I had dreamt of so much as a child, now home to some ungodly nightmare. There were a fair amount of cobwebs down here as well, along with a layer of dust so thick you could slice it like butter. I couldn't see much from the light filtering down from above, but I could tell I was in a large space from how my voice echoed off the walls. There was a work table close by that I dragged to the window so my escape could be fast if need be. As I stepped forward, I felt my feet catching on something hard. Whatever it was everywhere. I felt around my pants for my phone. Once I found it, I switched on my flashlight. Dear God, I really wish I hadn't. Bones. Animal bones. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They were covering almost every inch of the basement floor from about 6 feet away from the cellar. And between the cracks in the bones and walls, I could make out dried blood smears. And the room just seemed to stretch on into the pitch black. Some of the bones still had shreds of skin and flesh hanging to them. It took every bit of strength I had not to violently hurl onto the floor. But I knew whatever was down here would smell it and discover that I was here as well, if it didn't know already. I scanned the room with my flashlight, looking for any sign of Ollie, any hope that he might still be alive. And that hope died the instant I saw his bloodied collar on the ground. There was no body, no skin or torn appendages. Just this one final memento of my best friend. now gone forever. I crossed the room to grab it, shoving it in my back pocket. As I did, I caught something out of the corner of my eye with the flashlight. I shined it over in that direction and saw a collection of knives hanging from the walls. But beside them were rows of shelves, all containing jars of liquid. I couldn't see them with the glow of the flashlight, so I got closer. That's when I saw that the jars weren't just full of liquid. They were full of severed body parts, hooves, ears, paws, and what I assumed to be genitals. I never paid much attention to the high turnover of goats and dogs at the farm. My parents told me animals got sick easier on farms, and it was normal for them to drop dead or run away and disappear. I believed them when they would tell me that my boxer of 7 years ran away because I left the back door open, or that Sadie, our mother goat, was attacked by a fox the night before. And now I was beginning to wonder, what were my parents doing down here? What else were they keeping from me? Or what other secrets did they take with them to the grave? Secrets that I'll never know now. I took a step backwards and could feel a light thread laying straight across my face. More webs. I brushed it out of my face and turned around when I felt another thread of web string right across me. Then another. It started coming down very fast and without warning. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something moving overhead, but it was gone the second I had looked for it. They were coming from every direction now, more and more webs. Panic began settling in. I could barely move. I kept swatting the webs out of my face, only for them to be replaced by even more strands. A large bone behind me caught my leg, and it sent me pummeling to the ground. I could hear the breaking and snapping of more bones beneath me, as well as the crawling sound that I had heard in the house before. I was petrified. This is how it was going to end for me. Alone in my parents' basement, just another meal for whatever horror they were keeping down here. I cried out for Ollie, even though I knew he was long gone. I cried out for my mother, even though I had just seen her decomposing body not only an hour ago. And I called out for my father, even though I knew he had lied to me all those years about the basement, about this house. It was then that I heard the pitter-patter of tiny legs again. Only this time it was different. I wasn't hearing them. I was feeling them. Up my back, on my neck. Then a lone rattle. That was all it took for my fear to vanish instantly. I kicked myself off the ground, brushing aside the webs that kept falling around me, and pushed myself with all my might. I leaped onto the table and hoisted myself out of the cellar and back into the receding daylight. Without missing a beat, I slammed the cellar doors back in place, though now it was without a lock to seal them back up. Thinking on my feet, I wedged the fire poker into the lock, knowing it wouldn't hold forever. I hesitated, waiting for the moment the cellar doors to give way and the monster from within to burst out. But all was quiet. The wind blew slightly, and cooling off my burning forehead and giving me some peace of mind. It was now or never. Whatever was in that cellar, it was going to come out if it wanted to. And I didn't want to be anywhere near here when it did. Took one final look at the house before turning around and bolting down the driveway. No matter what, I had to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. I ran all the way to Christine's house. Once I caught my breath, I pounded on the door, and when she answered, I just told her everything. The entire story just came out of me all at once. I had expected her to laugh me off, not take it seriously. At the very least, I was expecting some questions. But she simply took everything I said at face value, offering her condolences and spare bedroom for the night. I almost bought it. The act. Almost. Right before I had gotten to the part about Ollie, she cut me off, asking, "Is that what happened to Ollie?" Somehow she'd already known that I'd been able to rescue my beloved canine companion, and a twinkle in her eye told me she wasn't to be trusted. I put on my best poker face and bluffed my way through the rest of the conversation. It's been about 6 hours. I'm writing this all now at around midnight. I haven't slept a wink yet, though my eyes grow weary and my body aches from exhaustion. But I'm afraid to close my eyes, unsure if I'll ever open them again. Christine knows something. She'd known since the beginning. Surely the rest of the town knows then as well. I've been going over the possibilities ever since I began writing this down. What exactly had been in the basement? Were my parents feeding it? Why? Did it turn against them? So many questions I'll never know the answers to. I'm writing all of this down now because I have to go back to the house in the morning. My belongings, my clothes, the keys. But there's more. I need to know the truth. I have to know what happened to Ollie, to my parents. I've got one of Christine's pistols by my side tonight. She'll never even know it's missing. I've just got to know the truth. I'll be sure to write again once I've gotten my answers. Wish me luck.